For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Award-winning investigative journalist and author Carl Cowan joins me to discuss his chilling book, Mafia Land, Inside South Africa's Darkest Cartels. In your book, you describe South Africa not just as a land of crime, but a country captured by 1,000 knives, some wielded by criminals, others by politicians, business elites, and even the police. Could you explain what you mean by this frightening description of our country?
If you look at the book, I only deal with 12 different organized crime syndicates or mafias or cartels, depending on how they operate. But the reality in South Africa today is that there is so much organized crime, especially, or criminals that have become organized, that there are very few facets of life that you will come into interaction with on a daily basis that is not affected by serious or violent crime in one way or another. Now, violent crime, obviously, it's AK-47 wielding thugs. There are murders on an almost daily basis at this point that are related to procurement. But serious crime, and something that we often don't talk about as much, is also tender corruption, fraud, and these sort of things. So think about the contract to fix your roads in the street where you live or in the street where your office is. Somewhere behind that contract, there is some sort of negative influence or criminal influence that has operated in one way or another. And all of this means that the state's ability to actually spend money effectively has been reduced to something where we see enormous amounts of wastage and, of course, budget shortages. And we've all heard recently about the budget deficit, etc. So this is crime having a real world impact on the government's ability to provide basic services.
You write that there are, as you've just said, so many syndicates operating in South Africa that you couldn't cover them all, so you focused on 12. Let's start with the construction mafia, which demands a 30% cut of projects. How has this network become so deeply entrenched?
It's a very interesting example of something that's relatively contemporary. But as I set out in the book, the business model of the construction mafia is not unique to South Africa. What I've seen in just doing a bit of research on this is that the actual idea of extorting a construction company into providing work or kickbacks or appointing certain suppliers or certain people from certain areas, that is a well-known tactic, and it was especially prevalent in New York, but with the New York families and the mafia there, and how they basically took over everything from the concrete supply to the unions, deciding who would work on what construction site and at what rates, etc. And they actually drove up concrete prices in the 70s and 80s in New York to something like 70% more expensive than anywhere else in the United States. So in South Africa, what we have is, as a result of deep inequality, because of our very unique history in terms of how our economy was structured just under 30 years ago during apartheid, and now there are procurement regulations and procurement laws that seek to redress those problems, to say, look, we had for generations people excluded from the economy, so we're going to try and fix that. One of those is a requirement by National Treasury that any project have a 25% or 30% local content. And that includes hiring people from the local area where these construction projects are happening, or hiring companies that are established in that area, etc. And the construction mafia have taken this sort of very noble idea, and they've gone and they said, well, look, if we can control the people who are appointed to that construction site or the subcontractors that are appointed there, we can make quite a lot of money. Obviously, the problem then is that these individuals don't necessarily have any expertise. They're not quantity surveyors. They're not professional services teams. They don't supply concrete. They don't supply bricks. They don't have yellow plant that can be hired. So instead of building up that expertise over time, and as anyone who has built a business, particularly in that sector, will know, it takes years and years and years. They have decided that through the use of force and blackmail and extortion and sometimes murder, they can gain access to that 25% of the project and effectively file an invoice once a month and not really ever be on site. So it defeats the entire purpose of these procurement laws. There's no skills transfer. The local community doesn't really benefit. And we see hundreds of billions of rands worth of construction projects across the country affected by this. Some have fought back. others have not been able to. So we have a situation now where the construction mafia is actually becoming stronger and stronger every day and spreading further and further around the country.
Taxis form the backbone of public transport, moving millions of South Africans every day. Yet, despite being a multi-billion rand industry, it remains largely unregulated. Can you speak how rival taxi associations often turn to violence to secure routes and power?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. They operate like a law unto themselves, and because the taxi industry is just so lucrative, it's billions of rands every year. There's just so much money floating around, and it's these taxi owners, and particularly the big taxi bosses, they're not exactly people who report all of their income to SARS appropriately and all of these sort of things. So imagine, if you will, warlords who all control certain sections of a route or a town or a city or a province, and no one else is allowed to operate there. No one else is allowed to make any money from any taxis operating there. And it's all very strictly controlled in this sort of very opaque structures of authority and hierarchy that is understood by people who work in the industry very well. But for outsiders like us, it appears very disjointed and loose and not really cooperating with one another. Now, as a result of this space being so highly contested, these rival taxi associations and even taxi bosses who have control over certain areas, they have a cottage industry within this industry has grown of security companies. So it started out as a need to protect themselves, and then it morphed into a need to take out their rivals. And now, actually, quite funny, what we've seen is that these security companies that have sprung up that are all owned by these various very powerful taxi bosses, they have now actually started providing security for construction sites to fight against the construction mafia, because the police are simply not equipped. And imagine, if you will, that these taxi empires have been growing and growing and growing. They are sitting on war chests of billions of rands that are just completely unaccountable and untraceable. And they are heavily armed, AK-47s, other semi-automatic rifles, bulletproof vests. They move in quantum taxis, armed to the teeth, And within that, we see a lot of our very high-profile assassinations. I'm thinking particularly of Babita Deokaran, of other individuals. We can trace most of these assassinations back to taxi industry hitmen. They cut their teeth murdering taxi drivers or taxi owners, and some, in extreme cases, the bosses and the provincial bosses of councils and associations. And they then have set up their own very lucrative industry, the assassination industry, to effectively hire out their services to anyone who can pay them. And this is all a result of the lack of regulation. But unfortunately, we are now in a situation where I do not believe that the South African police force, combined with our military, have the same firepower or resources as the taxi industry.
Then we go to the tanker mafia, where communities without access to water have become victims of exploitation. Tell us how what should be a public service has turned into an opportunity for unscrupulous operators.
Yeah, so the story of the water tanker mafia starts in that very boring old story about the lack of maintenance of infrastructure. It's just one of those things that has fallen by the wayside in municipalities around the country. And if you speak to councillors, particularly at a local level, they always blame a lack of resources. They always say that, over many years, we didn't have enough money to actually maintain these things. So over the past 15 to 20 years, the water infrastructure around the country has just slowly started falling into disrepair. I do not think that there is a town or city in the country that does not have significant challenges with its water systems. Cape Town and many towns in the Western Cape are obvious, outliers, but there are still issues there. There are still water supply problems there. But, if I think of particularly the city that I live in, Johannesburg, and our neighboring city, Tshwane, there are multitude of problems. The infrastructure is old. Some of it was put in the 70s. It hasn't really been updated and fixed. And as a result of that steady degradation, that lack of expertise within municipalities to invest in maintenance, etc., municipalities have had to resort to hiring water tankers or buying water tankers to deliver potable water to communities. And The moment that door was opened, it was an emergency measure. The moment that door was opened, the opportunity crept in. So we immediately started seeing stories about corruption within the tenders, how they were awarded. Now we have situations where water infrastructure is actually being sabotaged in order for those contracts to keep going. So it is a crisis entirely of our own making, and I think it is a crisis that is imminently solvable because, for example, Tshwane spent 400 million rand a year on average over the last 3 or 4 years on water tankers. 400 million rand doesn't sound like a lot if you look at the overall budget, but if you think of what 400 million rand can buy you in terms of maintaining existing infrastructure, once your capital outlay on installing the infrastructure is done, maintenance is very critical and can be expensive, particularly in water systems, but is also very simple. Unless we're dealing with bulk water supply issues, it's not a very difficult engineering job to just maintain water systems, particularly the reticulation systems. So it's one of those very interesting ones where it started out as plain old tender corruption and, sometimes linked to politicians or officials working at certain areas. And it has now grown into what I call the water tanker mafia, because now we have people are being murdered, people are being threatened and blackmailed, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, where the space is so contested already because of all the other criminal networks operating there. But don't discount the effect of water tanker mafias like these in small municipalities around the country. I'm particularly thinking of an example in the Eastern Cape, after the floods there quite recently, and Gift of the Givers, who's such a well-known charity, reported to the public that they had been threatened and been told to stop giving water to people who, their entire lives had just literally been washed away in these floods. And these water tanker mafia guys actually threatened them and said, listen, you have to stop doing this, because obviously they wanted the tender to supply the water.
You also write about the Kusile mafia. Kusile is one of Eskom's 2 largest coal-fired power stations that have run massively over budget and over time. Can you describe how disastrously things can go wrong when organized criminal networks infiltrate projects of this scale?
Oh, that's a great question. We've all heard the story that Kusile Power Station has been delayed and it's over budget, and seeking to answer that question, over many years, my colleagues at News 24 and we've written a series of articles called the Eskom Files, where we delved specifically into corruption at Kusile. To give you an idea, Kusile was supposed to be finished, done, up and running in 2015. It is now 10 years later. The last unit is still under construction. So just in terms of time, we already have a 10-year delay. Then in terms of money, initially Kusile was going to cost, 70 or 80 billion rand in 2007 money. It is now going to cost 250, 260 billion, estimated cost to completion. That's with the addition of the flue gas desulfurization plants, etc. So, I think the majority of that delay and cost increase, and there are normal contract price escalations, annual for annual inflation, all of that sort of things do exist as well. But I think the lion's share of the increase in cost and the delay in time is due to corruption that happened at Kusile. And we had the very Eskom and sort of officials in charge of that project meant to be keeping it on track in Abraham Masangu and Frans Tlakudi, and there are others, but they are the two main guys. How they perverted and corrupted the entire project management system at Kusile by offering to approve variances and variation orders on contracts when they knew they probably shouldn't. And I'm talking about some of the biggest construction companies in the country, and we know who they are. Stefanuti Stocks, Essor Construction, Basil Reed, WBHO, all of these companies were found in one way or another to have been wrapped up in the scheme. And just to digress a little bit, variation orders, either increase the contract time or the contract value, and that allows you to sort of extract more money out of it. And variations would normally have to be done because the project is so delayed. But what happened here is that through approving claims that Eskom probably could have fought and successfully fought against the contractors, they ensured that those claims would be approved by demanding kickbacks being paid to them. And about 120 million rand was paid in kickbacks back to them. And that is a real tangible effect of corruption. And now what I set out in the chapter, which I found just this fascinating story, is how they actually went from, normal construction sites and everything operating semi-normally and everything, to seizing control of that entire value chain to make sure that they could extract that money at the end of the day. And, it's such a frustrating story, because if you think of the effect that a fully functioning Kusile could have had on reducing load shedding over the last 5 years, now we're in a good space. Things are going okay. Eskom seems to be doing all right. It's not going to be that way forever. And it wasn't that way just a few short years ago. But if Kusile had been up and running, in my humble estimation, we could have avoided at least 2 stages of load shedding just from that one power station alone operating properly. And the cost to the economy, the knock-on effect, the ripple effect and cost, we're talking about billions and billions of rands.
Your hospital mafia chapter reveals how Gauteng's public hospitals have been drained by criminal networks that have stolen billions in taxpayers' money. Could you share more about your findings there?
Yeah, so I must give credit up front. Almost that entire hospital mafia chapter is based on the excellent work of my colleague Jeff Wicks, who has also published his own book, The Shadow State, about this very specific topic in the murder of Babita Deokaran. And I shamelessly rode his coattails for that, and I was fortunate enough to have helped in minuscule ways here and there, just to give him motivation and keep him going. But to make a very long, complicated story short, Tembisa Hospital is the bottom of imagine the money value chain, and it is the bottom. It is the tap that was turned open. And over the course of 3.5 years, organized criminal syndicates extracted about 2 billion rand from the Gauteng Department of Health through that specific hospital. And it was done through plain old tender corruption and fraud. It was just cover quoting, fake invoicing, all of this sort of thing, and not delivering the goods. And they obviously did that with the help of people within the Gauteng Department of Health and at the hospital itself. And it's just such a fascinating story how, for example, the hospital kept on spending for about 3 years in a row, way above its actual budget. But they kept on extracting the money, and none of those goods and services were delivered. And we're talking about, 400,000 rand for plastic buckets and just really crazy things. And all the documentation behind these transactions, it was all just fraudulent and lumped together to give the appearance of, a legitimate transaction. So these various syndicates, and it is my belief that they were operating together in one way or another, even though they are distinct and withdrew their own distinct benefits. And it's just such a horrifying story, because Tembisa Hospital is just one of the taps that they were withdrawing money through. There are so many others. And what really frightens me about it is that the level of complicity from Gauteng Department of Health officials in seeing that continue for so long. And then when Babita Deokaran flagged it and said, look, I can't believe that any of this is proper. We need to investigate this. She was betrayed by her colleagues, and it led to her death. And this is the full circle. And this is what I love about Jeff's work, is that he was able to give us the entire picture of this, from the very purchase order filed within the administration office right down to the effects that it had on patients dying in that hospital as a result of the poor services offered there.
Your chapter on the police mafia opens with a press briefing by Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, where he made serious allegations of corruption and political interference within the police. Please, can you speak to us about the rot, rivalry and racketeering within the very institutions meant to uphold the law in South Africa?
Yeah. So just as organized crime has infiltrated almost any sort of procurement or industry that you can imagine, right? So too have the police been infiltrated. So I like to use this example because it's very visceral. If you look at a chapter in the book about the cash and transit mafia, I use the example of Sipho McLean, who was arrested and released 22 times in just a little over a decade. And he wasn't being arrested for shoplifting or, jaywalking or anything. He was being arrested, for example, being in possession of explosives, being in possession of unlicensed firearms, hijacking cars. And he was on multiple occasions arrested on suspicion of cash and transit robbery. His 21st arrest he was involved in a cash and transit robbery in Siabuswa in Mpumalanga. And he was shot in the stomach by a police officer during the ensuing fight with the cops trying to arrest these guys. He drove a short distance away and was arrested by the cops, sort of bleeding and in pain in the vehicle. He was released after he got out of hospital. He made 1 or 2 appearances in court. That case has disappeared. It has just disappeared into the ether. And if you understand how the criminal justice system works, particularly at a magisterial level, that means that there were police officers, prosecutors, and a magistrate involved in that entire interaction that saw him being released. And that is a perfect microcosm for, imagine how many crimes. I'd heard an absolutely haunting statistic the other day. The National Prosecuting Authority prosecutes on average, and I'm talking about like contact crimes, murders, rapes, burglaries, thefts, that sort of thing, 800,000 crimes a year move through our court systems. It is just an overwhelming deluge. And if you then look at what the police are and how they are being forced to operate, it becomes very clear very quickly the moment you scrutinize any case or any instance, like Mr. McLean's instance, that the police are complicit. And our communities know this. They know this. They know that they cannot trust the police. In fact, the CSIR, a recent study that came out, and I referenced this, trust in our police service is the lowest it's ever been. So if that is true on a local level, if cops on the ground are not to be trusted, not all of them in any event, that stands to reason that the higher you move up the hierarchy and the chain in the police, the bigger the crimes become, the bigger the criminals become, the more insidious the influence is, the more politically exposed it becomes. And that's why we see General Mkhonazi standing up and saying, look, I believe that there is political interference. And this entire fight centers around the control of crime intelligence and the disbandment of the political killings task team. Now, you and I can probably have a 5-hour-long conversation about whether the political killings task team was truly effective or not, and whether General Mkhonazi had all the evidence that he needed to make the allegations he made when he made them. But what I can say to you today is that they are certainly trying very hard with raids, of General Shadrach Sibiya's house to find that evidence, to back up what they are saying. Whether they're going to actually find it is a different story altogether. I do not agree with everything General Mkhonazi has said. I think that he has connected some dots that shouldn't be connected. But at its core, General Mkhonazi's message is true. There are major, major problems within the police. And that's why in my book, I call them the police mafia, because they operate like one. It's bribery and backhanders and envelopes under the table. And the saddest part of all of this is that there are police officers in this country, men and women, who dedicate their lives to fighting crime, who put their lives in danger on a daily basis to try and catch cash and transit robbers, kidnappers, house burglars, car hijackers. And they are all lumped together with all these bad people. But unfortunately, until we see some or other drastic intervention, the crime situation in South Africa is not going to change, because the people meant to be investigating it are far too often compromised themselves.
Beyond what we have spoken about, your book also explores the cash in transit mafia, cigarette mafia, bouncer mafia, Chancellor House mafia, kidnapping mafia, Krugersdorp mafia, and you mention countless others you couldn't explore in depth, including the coal, diesel, scrap metal, gold, drug and poaching mafias. Do you think South Africa can ever escape the grip of what you call a mafia land?
I think we can. And I know that many people are trying. We are seeing an increasing willingness from the police and the prosecutorial authorities to accept help from the private sector. The private security industry in South Africa is a multi-billion rand industry. It has amazing resources, amazing people working there, people with decades of experience as former police or, private security, trained in private security matters. And if we genuinely start implementing just common sense things, making police dockets electronic, for example. There's an electronic tracking system, but our poor cops and detectives still have to lug around these files, these brown files upon files just for, any old case. And it's just hopelessly inefficient. If we can start there. But what we also have to start doing, and as we have to accept this, is that we're never going to solve all the crime that's already happened. There's just simply too much of it. So we now have to focus, and I mean drastically and radically focus on cutting down the instances of crime before they happen. To do that, one of the major things we have to do is we have to address unemployment, which means we have to address economic growth, which means we have to address political policy, which unfortunately, the policies as they are in this country today are so prescriptive and prohibitive to growth and are just basically, I think, solely responsible for not allowing the economy to grow. Our electricity problem was a massive issue. We've solved it for now, but we're still not at economic growth levels of electricity supply. So we have to resolve that problem. And by cutting down, for example, the way government procures, and it's also still a paper-based system in 2025. If we start working on prevention now and accepting that some crimes are never going to be solved, we can start to focus on arriving at consequences for the bigger players sooner and cutting off vast amounts of resources to criminal networks by ensuring that the supply of money dries up. Now, to do that would require an almost miracle level of cooperation between the South African authorities. It will require egos to be left at the door, which unfortunately is not going to happen. So, yes, it can be done, but it's going to require a lot of common sense. And I genuinely believe that we have to draft in help from outside, from law enforcement agencies, from other parts in the world that have held absolutely massive problems with organized crime and have not completely eradicated it, but learned to build a system that ensures people can live with it.
Finally, investigative journalists like yourself take huge personal risks to expose corruption and criminality. How has this work affected your own life?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it is very stressful. It is something that you do assume a lot of risk, and it's one of those things. But I think that the public interest outweighs any sort of personal concerns. I obviously take extraordinary precautions, and various security things are in place, and my company does support us fantastically in this, and it allows us that space to continue. The heaviest toll is obviously on people in your personal life whose own movements are sometimes curtailed and prescribed to by security concerns. So it is a sacrifice, but not a major one. It's not. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm some sort of martyr for the cause of South Africa, but I do believe that the public interest and the satisfaction that I get from ensuring that some accountability is seen, particularly in areas where people don't want any accountability to happen, I think that's worth it. And if we all can do at least one thing like that in our lifetime, I think the greater the amount of contributions will be, then we'll all get there in the end. And I think we can honestly, because this country is such a beautiful place. It's such a wonderful place to live and be and exist. And if we can just solve some of these problems, if we can just get some of these really bad characters out of the way and locked up somewhere safely, I think that we can all start to prosper and live a much better life. And that's my genuine hope. I know it sounds idealistic, but it's genuinely what I signed up for, and happy to continue doing it.
That was Cowan discussing his book, Mafia Land, Inside South Africa's Darkest Cartels. Visit the Polity website to access more author interviews, news and information updates. If you haven't already, subscribe to Polity's email services, including our new monthly Polity Bookshelf email, to stay informed about the latest news and Polity Bookshelf developments.